Hi, I'm Sharon Schakel and I'm a quilter. I live in Olathe, Kansas, which is part of the Kansas City area. And since I retired from teaching college English a few years ago, I have really gotten interested in quilting. Part of quilting is not just new, but it's also taking old quilts and making them new. It's reinventing them. And so I'd like to give you 10 ideas of ways that you can take an old quilt and reinvent it to become something useful, and maybe beautiful even. So I'd like to explain first one of the issues with old quilts is that quite often when you see an old quilt, it's really been abused. It is faded and it's got holes in it. It may have been chewed by mice. It's been stored. It's yellowed, and it really is not useful anymore. It's too damaged to be used as a quilt. But often, if you look at just part of the quilt, you can find good parts in any quilt, and those parts can be remade into something new and useful. So I want you to think about what you could do after I give you these ideas. You can take a quilt that's maybe been in your family, been in the attic, you've cleaned out maybe grandma's house or someone that you know, and you find this box of quilts. And so if you're watching this video, you probably have old quilts that you'd like to have remade, or you'd like to do something with, or you'd like to honor the person who made the quilt. Now for me, the quilts were given to me by my sister, who is a quilt appraiser in Tampa, Florida. And we were talking a few years ago and she was showing me quilts, and I thought, wow, what could I do with these? Is there something else that could be done so that they're not sitting in a box deteriorating and there's no use to them anymore? So I really like the idea of reinventing parts of an old quilt into something beautiful. Part of the problem with an old quilt is that it may be, because it's been abused, it may be dirty and it may be holey, and there may be issues with it. It probably is discolored, and but the good part is that there's probably some sentimental value there. Now the quilts that I'm using for this video have no sentimental value to me. They don't mean anything to me. We don't know who they belong to, who made them. We don't even know where they came from. But we can tell quite a bit from the old quilt by looking at how it was made, the fabrics, the colors, and the patterns that were used, because there are certain eras and decades that will tell us about how old a quilt is. So I have a sample of an old quilt here, and this piece is a churn dash. It's quite frayed, it's quite old, but it's quite interesting too. It was made totally by hand, all hand stitching. The thread is still in pretty good shape. The fabric itself is really frayed on the edges from use. The binding is split in half, and the batting has gotten all lumpy. But this particular quilt really could not be taken apart. There's no way to remove the top and have it be strong enough. So usually when I remake a quilt, I reinvent it, I use the whole piece as one piece of fabric. I add new batting and new backing. So there are advantages and disadvantages to using these old quilts. My first examples will be using just one block. How can you make one block have a new life and give it some beauty? So my first idea is that you can take one block and you can make it into a banner for the wall in any room. I chose this one. It's the churn dash, the same pattern as what I just showed, but I picked this particular block because the solids allowed me to add words. And it's not really pretty, but it is fairly neutral. And I was able to add some trim on the side, add some bordering, give it a little bit of width, give it some stability by adding backing and batting to it. So in order to make the word gather and family, I was experimenting and I played around with stencils and used a pencil to make the letters, and then I stitched it on my machine. Now, this is an old quilt, old block. I want it to look old. So the issue with old quilts is that usually the fabric has been stretched out of shape. The stitching is in place, but there are a lot of wrinkles here. My point is, I don't need to make that look like it's brand new. I don't want it to look new. This is an old quilt. It's an antique probably because it's probably 70 years old, possibly more. So it's okay to let the viewer, to let the people in your family, if they know who made this quilt originally, it's okay to have the wrinkles here, and to have the original thread and stitches show, and to allow the fading. In some places it's really faded and you can see that the colors change, and to me that's the charm of using an old quilt and reinventing it. The next idea is idea number 2, is framing a quilt, and we'll look at that next. Okay, now the second idea I had is that I could take a frame and put the quilt in a frame. And this one block could be made any size I wanted to. But I had this frame on hand, so I thought, okay, I'll make this size. I put the block on point. This looks like Grandpa's shirt. This is especially sentimental to your family. You want to show it off. So I picked red and blue. I just added the triangles in the corners. I added the blue as a surround. And instead of using regular batting, I only used flannel because I didn't want it to get too thick. It has to fit within the frame beneath the glass, which will protect it. And the important thing about this is it doesn't really matter how fragile the blocks are when you frame them behind glass. Nobody's touching them. They're never going to be stretched or torn or used, and so the stability is not really an issue. I left some of the faded areas or the stronger colors show. You can see the stitching in here. You can see where it was put together and how it was done. And so it's just a pretty block. But I could have done a lot of different things to it. I could have made it into a patriotic block. I could have made it into a block that looked appropriate for maybe a boy's room, a young man's room. I could have done almost anything in almost any size. I could have made it into a full bedspread even. But here, I just needed to make it the size of this particular frame. Another example of framing is using a smaller frame and not making the block as big. So all I did on this one was add about a 1 inch of green fabric out of my stash, and then I added another 1.5 inches or so of the pink fabric so that I could pick up on the same colors that are in the turn dash and in the stripe. And it's kind of fun to look at these old patterns and how they were stitched. You can see the minute little stitches in there. You can see that the stripes in here are not all going in the same direction. Who knows what happened and why they did that. So it makes each block interesting. I can picture a woman sitting in a rocking chair on the front porch in the summer and making this block and having and knowing that this quilt will be used every day by her family. Now, the third idea is still using one block, but the challenge was, how could I make an old vintage block look modern? So that was my goal when I picked this particular block. It was blue and it was sort of attractive compared to most of the other blocks in that quilt that weren't particularly beautiful. This one was really quite nice. It's blue and white and gray. Of course it's faded, but I was able to add the darker blue around the outside, and then I decided I wanted the color scheme to be gray, blue, white, and a little bit of taupe. And I had found those fabrics in my stash, didn't have to buy much new except for the gray, and so my plan was to use stripes with lots of negative space, which is typical of a modern quilt today. And so I looked at a lot of patterns. I looked in many quilt stores. Then I drew up my own pattern on graph paper, set the fabrics in a way that I thought was pleasing, stitched them together, did the same pattern all the way around on all 4 sides. So this one is about 5 by 5. It's a fairly large quilt and would make a very nice throw for over the sofa, and it definitely has a modern look. I'll hang this over the bookcase so that you can see the entire piece. Okay, this quilt was called Vintage Goes Modern, and you can see the churn dash is here in the center. I didn't do a lot of quilting on this one. I kept it fairly simple. I just did a simple curve around the edge. I outline quilted the churn dash, and I just did lines throughout. Kept it very simple. I wanted the focus to be right here. I didn't want my quilting to distract from the block itself. This is the centerpiece. Then my quilting here is really just horizontal and vertical lines. I did do a little bit of fancier quilting in each of the corners, but basically in modern quilting it's kept simple, straight lines, and we have a wonderful vintage block as the centerpiece on this quilt. That is modern quilt number 3. Moving into the next tips, 4, 5, and 6 come from this particular quilt. So it's a little different. It's not the churn dash like the first one. This one is on point squares, and I can't say that it was a particularly pretty quilt, but it was quite interesting. It had some interesting colors in it, and I was able to separate the blocks and then put them into color coordinated groups. And so I could use 3 blocks, maybe 4 blocks if they worked together in the color. So this is one of the original blocks. I wouldn't call it pretty, but interesting maybe. And the colors were not colors that I could work with into any of the other ideas. And one of my favorite things to do when I have just 3 blocks is to make a table runner. So the first one, I was able to use the blocks, 2 blocks that had the polka dots in them. And the color scheme became black and white with some pink and a little bit of blue and yellow in there. And I wanted to make this sort of a funky kind of a table runner, sort of interesting. I wanted to include gray, which is a popular decorating color right now. So I of course cleaned the blocks. I kept them all in there are 3 layers as much as possible, washed them, dried them, and then added borders all around each of them. Then I added the triangles on the sides in order to make it a straight strip. I made them on point so that each end of the table runner is pointed. Then I decided it was time to add my mother's doilies. I have a whole bag full of doilies, and I thought, you know, this would be a fun way to give this table runner sort of a modern, eclectic look. It's a vintage, but it does have a little more updated look even with the doilies. So I added half on each side there, and I put 1 doily. They were similar, they weren't identical, in the middle of each of those, and came up with this rather clever table runner. Looks pretty cool. I was pleased with that one. It was a fun one to make and to see it develop. Then I made a table runner, but it was not of the same pattern. These are embroidered blocks, and I was able to separate those blocks into 2 different color ranges, and I made this one a spring color range with yellow, purple, and pink and green. So each of the embroidered blocks, it's a butterfly with flowers, and the embroiderer must have run out of embroidery floss at some point, because this butterfly is all outlined in black, whereas this one is part gray, part black, part whatever. So I'm picturing some woman, maybe out in the country, doing her embroidery work, running out of floss and making do with what she had. So this is really interesting because of the variation in the embroidery floss. And I was able to take those particular blocks. I think I had to keep in the 3 parts also. I couldn't pull them apart. Occasionally I can pull the top off, use the top separately, and stabilize it, but these had to be done that way. Then I just sewed strips of fabric together, cut them in half, made a V opposite directions, made it into a pointed table runner on point, added new backing and batting, and a new binding. And now we have a spring table runner. Now I'll zoom the camera in just a little bit on each one of these to give you a little better look of the stitching. I quilted this in circles because that's the way the original one was done, and I like to stay a little bit similar to how the original quilt was. And then on this one, I just outlined all of the embroidery work. I like to do free motion quilting, and I like to keep it fairly close together because it does stabilize it. It will keep all of these pieces together. And these will not be used in a stressful way, and so they're not going to be washed off and probably just shaken to get rid of the dust. So it's easier to use a little more fragile pieces in this type of a reinvention than in some of the other things. And now I'll zoom in. So just do a little quick zoom in and out. Now, the next idea, number 5, goes back to the blocks from this original quilt that you already saw, one table runner. And so I wanted to try something different instead of doing the blocks all vertical. So I used 4 blocks here. They all had something in common. My printer distorted the color down here. This really isn't as yellow, but printers do that sometimes. So I was able to pick up on the blues and the ivory in those particular blocks and make it into either a table topper. It was about 30 maybe by 36, or it could be a lap quilt. Maybe you just like to have a little cover over you when you're sitting and reading, or maybe someone's in a wheelchair and you just want a little cover for the lap. So this worked. I wanted to make it a little bit larger, almost square, so I added 2 rows of the checkerboard in the green, which came out of the original blocks. That same idea, same color scheme, and then added the blue and the sashing and the border with the cornerstones. Again, I added batting and backing and made it into what looks like a new quilt, and that one was sold at the auction in Tampa, Florida also. Then I wanted to try and make something a little more masculine. Quite often quilts end up being a little more on the feminine side. So I played with the blocks that had black and red in them and picked all of those with at least some red. Now this looks like it might have been an old picnic tablecloth. I don't know. This particular print is really cute. It has beach chairs on it. So these were real unusual fabrics. They were coming out with different fabrics in the 40s. So I have a feeling that maybe this quilt comes from the 40s rather than the 30s. But I'm not a historian. I'm not a quilt appraiser. I don't know the real details. I'm just sort of guessing what era these quilts come from. So on this one, I added a little more in the middle. I added a little more in the top, some half square triangles here, and used a black print, and then I wanted to make it pop with the red trim all the way around the edge, added a black border and binding. So with new batting and backing, it becomes a new quilt. It's a little bit longer, so if someone had longer legs in a wheelchair or wanted to sit in their recliner, that would cover their legs. And so this one has a little more masculine look, and that's idea number 5. We'll move on to idea number 6 next. Okay, idea number 6 is the same, use the same blocks as the other 2 from this original quilt. So this goofy quilt, as unattractive as it was, made 3 different rather attractive, beautiful quilts. And so the third idea is that I was able to take 4 blocks from the original quilt. I think it was this one and this one and this one and then one other. The whole quilt is not shown there. And I made more blocks in that same pattern. It was a very simple pattern, so I could just measure the blocks, see what they were, and this is an old one, here's an old one, and here, and here. And this was sold at the auction in Tampa last year, and the person who bought it came to me after and she said, well, which of these blocks are the old ones? So I was very proud that the fabrics that I picked for the new blocks were enough like the old, which is, what did I say, 70 years old or so, that I was able to make this quilt an updated quilt in blues and browns and give it a whole new life, make it a bigger quilt. I don't have it anymore, so I can't tell you the size. I think it was about 5 by 5, possibly. May have been 4 by 5, something like that. And really all I did was just add sashing in between and a new border and new binding. I had a little trouble finding the navy blue, which seems strange that I couldn't find navy blue fabric for the backing, and eventually I did find it. But I thought it was a little bit bland and I wanted to give it a little bit more interest, so I made some stripes of fabric of the navy blue that I used for the backing, and I just stitched those down on either side, 1/2 inch wide or so, and framed in the center of each of those. So this was a whole new look. I had 4 old blocks and I made 5 new ones, and then of course new batting and backing, and it has a whole new life. Now it looks a little rippled here because when I took this picture it was laying on my love seat and I didn't realize I was going to use this for the video. So don't pay attention to the little wave in there. It really was smooth and flat. It's just that when I take pictures with my phone, who knows where they'll be and when I'll use them. Okay, and we'll move on to number 7 with a completely different idea. Now, the next one, number 7, the idea, came from this little quilt, which wasn't actually a quilt, it was really a bedspread that had embroidered blocks. Half of the blocks were little angels embroidered, and the other half were little circus animals. So I separated them into 2 groups, and I took the little angels, and I took it all apart. Gingham was popular in the 50s, I think, so these are probably from the 50s. The fabric was still pretty good, but I think I did stabilize it with a little bit of t-shirt fusible that's used in making t-shirt quilts. So I made new blocks. I framed them in printed fabric. I made it in typical little girl colors, and this one became the Angel Kisses applique quilt. So then I had the 4 embroidered blocks, but I needed to have 5 angels. So I found a little pattern for an angel. I appliqued white angels, and each of the angels is kissing something, a bird, a butterfly, so I can't remember even what all they're kissing. So each of these angels was appliqued onto solid fabric. I did a lot of stippling quilting into those and kept that color scheme. Just did white Kona cotton as the sashing, and of course I pre-washed it all so that this can be washed. Of course it'd be better not to wash it in a machine, be better to wash it by hand, but this is almost mostly new fabric other than the fabric that the embroidery was done on. But I stabilized it, new batting, new backing, new binding, and so on. Because this will be a quilt that's used for a child, it has to be made strong enough that it can endure some kind of washing periodically. Moving on now to number 8, this is another really different kind of a quilt that I used. About the only thing that was still good in this quilt was the sunbonnet Sue. So on this one I had to cut them out in order to be able to use them as an applique for a completely new quilt. In general, the little sunbonnet Sue dolls were in pretty good shape. I had to replace one of the little dresses, and that was about it. I just applied it over the top because there were holes in that one, and I had this one left over. So I put it on new fabric, just a solid off-white fabric, and made new blocks. I made the Irish chain to go through the center. I used little girl colors that were similar to the colors in the dresses, and then I just quilted it in a typical diagonal. And this quilt then became almost completely new fabric. Again, pre-washed, so that if it's going to be used for a child, it has to be sturdy, has to be washable. And so this was stabilized by outlining, doing I think I did a satin stitch around the dolls, and then I stitched a little outline around the bonnet, around the arms and the legs, so that those will remain strong enough so that a child, a young girl, a little girl, can use them. And on to the last 2 ideas, number 9 and 10. Well, we're down toward the end now. We have just number 9 and 10, and I used these two quilts in one. So for number 9, the idea is that I was given by my sister in Florida the quilt top, and it wasn't very big, but it was big enough because I wanted to do this funky garden floral concept, and I decided instead of using a purchased back, I would be able to use this cool back that's probably from the 30s or 40s. And it's in the star design. I don't know the actual name of this print, but look at all the different fabrics that are in here. I'm sure there must be some duplicates, and this was probably a scrappy quilt at the time. It was a little bit yellowed, and I didn't get all of the discoloration out of it. I did wash it by machine, and I shouldn't have. I put it on hand wash, and even so, it frayed a bit, and then it took me a long time to press it properly, and I would have been much better off if I had just put it in the sink and let it soak with either Dawn or with quilt soap and done it that way. But it did hold up very well. So this particular thing, this top had never been quilted, and it became the backing. So when I quilted it on the front, it didn't really matter what quilt design I used because this is an overall pattern that really isn't going to show up on the back anyway. So either side is going to be very attractive. So I'm going to open this up now, and we'll see the last idea for using old quilts. So my last idea is using the old quilt as the background for an art quilt or another kind of quilt. And this is the piece. I still have some of the pieces that I didn't use, and this had been repaired before. I'm not sure how old it is, but there are hexes in there, and it was very discolored. You can see how dark the yellowed the fabric is, but the fabric was in fairly good shape, although I can see light through it, so I know that it's fairly fragile. And I soaked each individual square in the sink with a little bit of quilt soap, and if I need a little more power to it, I'll add a little bit of dishwashing powder. So it became fairly light colored. It had a small print in red, yellow, blue, and a pink center, and then it had pink with the floral center. So they were done in a circle, and there were light yellow, well, it's a four-sided diamond in between. So I used 9 of these squares to make one background. So they're 3 across and 3 down. And then I just connected them with Kona cotton and washed it, pre-washed it of course, and made the one full top with the 9 blocks. You can't even really see, unless you're very close up, that there is a sash in there. I was lucky enough to be able to match that very closely. So once I had the top parts together, I added this red trim, and I wanted to make those flowers pop. The flowers are done by machine. I don't do any hand quilting. I don't have the patience, so I have to admit that that's something that I will not do. I admire it when other people do it. I will not do it myself. But I did turn the edges on all of these. I didn't make it a raw edge, which is what I usually do. And then I just used a blanket stitch around the edges. I did some free motion quilting and a little thread painting in the leaves. I added decoration. I added veins. I added all kinds of trim. I just had fun with this, adding all of these flowers. And really, once this flower garden is on here, you really hardly notice the hexes that are in there, and that was cool. And there were places where that old fabric was a little bit frayed, and there were some holes. I was able to just cover it over. Didn't matter. So by the time I added a new batting and backing on it, this old quilt, what's back here is the background of this garden, is very strong. There's no problem with it. Usually when I do free motion quilting, my spaces apart are about 1 inch, sometimes less, and that helps stabilize the old quilt also. But I decided to get a little creative, and my quilting here is a hummingbird and a butterfly and a dragonfly and So all the way throughout, instead of just doing an overall pattern, I made garden figures, garden insects, and so on throughout. And so this is one of my favorite quilts. This one was shown at the Sisters Outdoor Show in Sisters, Oregon last year. And it was a fun one. Then I took those same colors that I used in the flowers and I made the rainbow diagonals in the squares all the way around the edges to make the center, make your eye go right to the center and make the whole thing pop. So this one was just a fun one. It took me a lot of time to do all of the applique, and everyone knows, all the quilters in my neighborhood know I'm not very patient, but I stuck with this one, and I wanted all of these leaves and vines and flowers to really pop in this quilt. So when I got to the border, I used that same quilting idea. This has a dragonfly, here's butterflies, and so I didn't do any stitching in the ditch except to stabilize along the edges. And this has a hummingbird, here's some more leaves and butterflies, and so the whole thing is quilted in that garden theme, in the garden motif. So this one was fun. Used two quilts, two ideas, various ways that you can do that you can reuse and reinvent the quilt. Now, one more thing I'd like to share with you on reinventing quilts, and this is becoming more and more important, it seems, and there's a real focus on documenting what we have made. One of the things that is sort of frustrating when I work on these old quilts is that I wish I knew where they came from, what state, and who was the person who made this, and when was it. And so now we are really into documenting these quilts. Now this is a pre-made label. I colored it in with permanent markers just to give it that garden look. I put the name of the quilt, it's Funky Vintage, and it says Pieced and Quilted by Sharon Kreun Schakel, Olathe, Kansas, 2018. Vintage background and backing of unknown origin. Now, wouldn't it have been wonderful if one of these quilts had belonged to someone in my family and I could say, this quilt was made by Aunt Myrtle, or this was made by my grandmother Toonie from Holland. I wish that I had some quilts like that. I don't have anything. So if you have quilts in your closet, in your attic, and you can bring those out, you can make something very creative. You can do all kinds of things. I hope I've inspired you and given you lots of ideas of ways that you can reinvent these old quilts. If you have already done this in the past, it would be great to hear from you. Here is my email address. It's sharadare@gmail.com. And it would be fun to see pictures. If you've got any pictures of something you've done, we can expand and share the knowledge of reinventing, of updating, and making something that's outdated into an updated quilt. Happy quilting!